Welcome, everyone. This is the International Methods Colloquium. My name is Jess Nessery. I'm an Associate Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Wake Forest University. The IMC is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Wake University and also sponsored by Springer Publishing. This week's speakers are Amber Boydstun of UC Davis and Jessica Feezell of the University of New Mexico. Their talk is entitled Self-Coding, a Method to Assess Semantic Validity and Bias When Coding Open-Ended Responses. And as you can see, this is joint work with Rebecca Glazer of the University of Arkansas. The talk will last between 30 or 40 minutes, at which point we will take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window, and you can ask that question at any time during the talk, but we will hold all questions till the end of the presentation unless it's something very immediate, like I can't see your slides or something like that. If you wish to be recognized and ask your question via audio, please indicate this in the Q&A text box. Otherwise, I will read your question during the Q&A period. A link to Amber and Jessica's paper and their slides will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window so that you may refer to it throughout the presentation. And now I'd like to welcome Amber Boydstun and Jessica Feezell to the IMC. Welcome.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you so much. We're happy to be here today, and we are fans of the program as much as we are participants today. So we just want to thank you for your hard work and thank the attendees for being here today to listen to us. I'm Jessica Feezell. This is Amber. Rebecca is probably having a nice cup of coffee on a cold morning. But the work is co-authored among the three of us, and we're all happy to take questions at the end today. So the work we're presenting today is actually published in Research and Politics, and it is a short piece. And so our presentation is also going to be rather brief, but we are excited to take this opportunity to hear your thoughts and your ideas about extensions or perhaps things that we haven't considered in the development of this, because it seems simple, but also kind of new. The title of our talk and our paper is Self-Coding, a Method to Assess Semantic Validity and Bias When Coding Open-Ended Responses. But really, our talk today is about a very simple skill that most of us learned in graduate school, making a good code book. More specifically, our talk is about how to make the best code book that you can for use in coding open-ended answers for public opinion surveys. So, using surveys to measure public opinion is something that we often do. And Amber and I need to get our dance together here. I'm going to grab my collar when I want you to advance the slide. So in survey-based research, open-ended responses are great. They're excellent. They're rich, they're nuanced, they're illuminating, and oftentimes they're much more what we would prefer than more discrete response options. However, coding open-ended responses is quite difficult. It is time-intensive. It often takes many people to do, intercoder reliability tests, etc. It also requires the development of comprehensive code books. And even the best code books can be problematic, as we will outline today. So most public opinion surveys use large sample sizes for increased external validity. And this is where things can get kind of tricky with open-ended responses in particular. Because analyzing large N surveys with open-ended answers requires coding responses often into summary categories. And as we hope to convince you, when trying to understand public opinion, coding rich data into simplified discrete codes and then perhaps aggregating those codes up can introduce bias into the findings. As we write in the paper, by assuming that all respondents who mentioned a certain phrase meant the same thing and should be coded the same way, we run the risk of misrepresenting true opinions of some non-random portion of our sample. So in this study, we focus on this concept of semantic validity. And semantic validity is concerned with the concept of miscoding respondents' open-ended answers in a way that might misrepresent what they're trying to say or what they think they're saying. Klaus Krippendorf calls this semantic validity. And he defines this in his 2008 address as the extent to which the results of coding correspond to how ordinary readers, or better still, the respondents themselves, would categorize what they are saying. To use a fun illustration from a classic movie, in this case, Inigo Montoya is the survey respondent and Vizzini is the researcher applying an inappropriate code to an open-ended response that Inigo has given. So if the researcher and the respondent disagree on the coding, the semantic validity is quite low. If the researcher and the respondent agree on the coding of an answer, then the semantic validity is high. And semantic validity is particularly salient because of the possibility that a researcher designed codebook might systematically misrepresent the responses of those with specific demographic characteristics. So to help diagnose problems with semantic validity and to improve our codebooks, we propose that asking respondents themselves for feedback on how to code their responses can actually be tremendously informative. So the standard operating procedure for coding an open-ended response usually looks something like this. We ask respondents a question. We solicit an open-ended answer because they're rich and beautiful and illuminating. And then we try to code those responses according to a predefined codebook, or a codebook perhaps in development even. However, we propose a different method. We begin also by asking respondents a question, and we solicit an open-ended answer. And then, however, we ask respondents to code their own answers according to the predefined codebook. Then, without consulting the respondents' codes, the same responses according to, or excuse me, we code as researchers the same responses according to the same predefined codebook. And then once both have done their coding, we reconcile those two, assess the validity of our codes. In other words, did we code them the same way that they would have coded themselves? And we revise the codebook if necessary. So to note, the iterative process of creating a codebook is not new, especially an original one. And as researchers, we strive to make sure that we have codes for every response so that we can turn coding assistance loose on raw data effectively. However, it's the element of using the respondents' feedback in this process to refine the codebook that we think is novel and useful, especially in improving the semantic validity when coding open-ended data. So for our study, we are using the codebook written by Shanto Iyengar in his formative and often cited book on media framing effects, titled Is Anyone Responsible?, published in 1994. And although this is only one codebook, this foundational study has led to 30 years of research furthering our understanding of how framing influences responsibility attribution for social problems, from gun violence to business failures to economic adversity and voter turnout. In his research, he finds that episodic frames, which highlight event-centered information and describe policy issues in terms of concrete instances, lead people to place responsibility on individuals for their circumstances. On the other hand, in his research, he also finds that using thematic frames, which place an issue in a broader, more general context, lead people to place responsibility instead on government or society for their circumstances. And so according to the standard operating procedures for replicating this work, and as he did, you apply either a treatment of an episodic frame or a thematic frame. You then ask your respondents an open-ended question, as he did in his book. In your opinion, what are the most important causes of poverty? And then you use the codebook that he's established to code open-ended answers into, in his case, 93 different categories. And then from those 93 categories, aggregate up into 3 broader categories that are used for analysis in the book, which are whether the blame is attributed to an individual, to government and society, or some other category. So for example, the codes that fall into the 93 different codes that the open-ended answers would be categorized into are on the left here in code description. Laziness would be the aggregate category of an individual. Sense of dependence would be the category of individual. And down below, unemployment, for example, would be coded as government or society. And for our purposes, we're going to focus on 4 specific categories: laziness, education, unemployment, and cost of living. And we're going to do this for 2 reasons. The first is that these are very common responses that are given. They're the modal categories that are offered to explain poverty. And also because they give us nice parity. 2 of them would be aggregated into the individual category and 2 would be aggregated into government and society. And I want to take a quick moment before handing it over to Amber to note that Chantal has been very generous in his sharing of his code book. Actually, the original, often hand-scrawled code book. His records of preservation are remarkable and to be modeled, and hopefully they'll end up in a wonderful museum someday. And so with that, I'll pass it to Amber to explain exactly how we proceeded with our study.
As Jess said, we used this same code book that is foundational to so much of what we understand about framing effects to test whether our self-coding method is useful. Specifically, we recruited 1,700 MTurk respondents in October of 2018. And just like in the classic standard operating procedures, they read a short news story that either gave them an episodic frame treatment or a thematic framed treatment. And then they were asked, in your opinion, what are the most important causes of poverty? And they gave open-ended responses that are rich and illuminating. They were allowed to give up to 10 open-ended responses. So up to this point, we're doing everything the same. We're just replicating previous research. But here's the twist. When respondents then gave us these open-ended responses, we asked them to code their own responses. We piped them back into them. And we said, when you say this, what do you mean by it? And then we coded a blind sample of those open-ended responses as we would have in the standard operating procedures. And then we compared the 2 coders, that is the respondents and us as researchers, to test for differences. So one of the basic questions here is, when we treat these like 2 independent coders, the respondents themselves and then us as researchers, do we get high intercoder reliability? Like, is the matching of our understanding of what they're trying to say strong enough that we would be willing to use this data through a classic content analysis approach? Specifically, I want to give you the language that we used. So they gave us open-ended responses, and then we piped them back like this. We said, when you say that one of the most important causes of poverty is whatever they said, do you think that cause is mostly because of individual people and the choices they make? Or is it mostly because of how government and society are these days? So you'll see what we've done here is we've embedded basically the definition of the aggregate categories in the codebook in this question, and we're forcing them to choose. And so when we think about applying this self-coding method to other codebooks, this is a critical step, right? Because this is us as researchers trying to signal to the respondents what we're trying to get at with those aggregate codes. But we can imagine, we've thought a lot about how this could apply to various different code books, and really the latent variables that we're trying to get at there with those aggregate codes, they should be such that we can communicate it in a short and pithy sentence like this. I want to give you an example of one of the types of open-ended responses that we got that really hits the heart of why we thought we should develop this method in the first place. And it's when asked what, in your mind, are the causes of poverty, people say lack of education. In fact, a lot of people say some version of lack of education. In total, we had 15 we had a bunch of responses, right? We had lots and lots of responses, and 23% of them were about some version of lack of education. So specifically 348 of the responses included this phrase lack of education. And those respondents who said something like lack of education in the individual, they tended to code that as individual. And those who said something like lack of education programs or lack of college opportunities, they tended to code them as government and society. But the vast majority of these 348 responses about lack of education just said lack of education. And I want to clarify here that if we as researchers were following the original code book, any version of lack of education would go under the specific education code, one of those 93 codes, and it would be aggregated up to the individual level. So it's impossible for us to know the intent behind these open-ended responses, but the respondents can tell us what they meant if we just ask them. So we use this data to answer two different research questions. First, again, how similar are the respondents' self-codings of their own open-ended responses to our coding of their responses using the pre-established codebook? Basically, do we get high enough intercode reliability that we would trust this data to go forward? And then second, do any of the variances in the respondent's self-coding of their items correlate with demographic characteristics, such that not only would we be worried that we're not capturing what respondents are really meaning, but that we're not capturing it in a non-random way? So what happens when we ask people to code themselves? Well, spoiler alert, they come up with results that are quite different from when we code them. Specifically, we coded a random sample of 200 respondents, 740 responses, because remember, each person was allowed to give more than one response based on this original code book. Our agreement was not bad, it was 75%, but Krippendorf's alpha was 0.46. So if you're conducting a normal quantitative content analysis with undergraduate research assistants in your lab, you wouldn't go forward with that data, right? You'd make sure that the intercoder reliability was higher than that. So in other words, when we asked respondents to code themselves, they provided codes that differed substantially from what we would have assumed following the code book. And then, as Jess mentioned, we drilled down on 4 different codes, specifically cost of living, unemployment, education, and laziness. So it's that education category that had that subset of 350 specific phrases of lack of education. And we used these 4 because in previous research in this area, we observed that these are 4 of the highest frequency categories that people use when attributing responsibility for poverty. But also they give us this nice balance between 2 items that the codebook would say are individual category codes, and 2 that the codebook would say are government and society codes. What we did is we looked through the entire corpus of the open-ended responses, and for each of these 4 codes, we used very simple keywords to try to grab a big net of all potential responses that were about that code. So for example, for cost of living, we included words like inflation, price, cost. And we, of course, stress tested the net of the keywords that we were using to grab them to try to avoid false negatives. And then we manually read all of the responses that each of these nets of keywords grabbed to eliminate false positives. And so the point here is to try to get at a selection of responses that we are totally confident meant cost of living or meant unemployment, education, laziness, that we definitely would have coded as researchers into the individual aggregate category in the latter 2 cases, and the government or society category in the former 2 cases. We then compared the codes that the respondents gave for each of these responses to the codes that we would have given them. And here's what we found. In the case of cost of living, remember that's a government society code according to the codebook, and laziness, that's an individual code. The respondents behaved exactly like we would as researchers. They generally thought that any response about cost of living was the government society's problem, and laziness is an individual problem. But with both unemployment and education, things get much more murky. And specifically in these 2 cases, if we are using the standard code book, we're missing what at least a minority in an education, half of the people are really trying to communicate, because as the education category conveys, it's so complicated, right? People can mean so many different things. So this is, we think, good evidence, in addition to the low Krippendorf's alpha, that we just don't have good intercoder reliability. But to our second question about whether not only are we not getting it right for a lot of respondents, but are we not getting it right in a non-random way, we looked at the demographic characteristics, and we simply tested the difference in attributing responsibility to government society versus the individual for the cases of poverty in two cases, these two cases that we care a lot about from the last slide, right? Those are the two middle cases, education and unemployment. And you can see that in many cases, like when the cause identified as education, there aren't any significant differences by gender, by race, by education, but there are cases where there are significant differences. And so this means, especially in the case of unemployment, that we're overrepresenting the accuracy of some of our participants and underrepresenting the accuracy of other participants. In other words, our analyses confirmed that, I was so sorry, Jess, I think that's your slide.
You were doing great.
Yeah, it's all right. Yeah, you take it. But I just wanted to finish up here by saying, in other words, we're significantly underrepresenting not just some people, but the type of people that we might be especially interested in getting accurate responses for when asking, for example, about poverty. If you think in particular about lower versus higher income people, we want to make sure that when we're asking about causes of poverty, we're getting equal representation across the board. All right, Jess, it's your turn.
Thank you, Amber. Fantastic. So we want to wrap up with some takeaways and some suggestions, and of course some limitations. So I think it's really important, we think it's really important to note these 2 points. One is that whether coded by researchers or respondents, despite the variation in coding, the overall findings are actually very similar and confirmed the framing effects already documented in the literature. That using, or it's important to note that using the self-coded data, respondents who received the thematic news frames were more likely to provide open-ended responses on the causes of poverty that attributed responsibility to government and society. So regardless of whether we coded it or the responses were coded by the respondents themselves, the overall findings are substantively the same. However, the fact that we replicated the substantive findings of Iyengar's earlier research does not change our documented evidence that for 2 major codes utilized, we are misrepresenting many of the respondents' intended answers and doing so in a non-random way. So as far as recommendations go for researchers, we have a few, and we're excited to hear sort of other areas where you think this might be utilized in your other areas that we haven't considered. But first, using the self-coding response technique to pre-test code books and to improve semantic validity, we think is especially useful, particularly for content that you suspect might be subject to diverse interpretations. And in this case, as always with the development and refining of a code book, it's important to iterate, retest, and make sure that you're getting it as right as you can. The second point is that there's sort of an added benefit of this technique in that you can use self-coding as a substitute for a traditional sort of trapping question attention check in order to make sure that respondents are paying attention rather than sufficing or acting in bad faith. So professional survey takers, which we're all increasingly using on platforms like MTurk, for example, who are completing surveys as quickly as possible, or perhaps foreign survey takers who do not understand the nuances of experimental treatments being applied, they're more likely to skip open-ended questions and perhaps give nonsensical responses or responses that frequently repeat words like good or nice, as found in the work by Ryan in 2020. So researchers could potentially use these words, good and nice, or create a word matrix to identify outlying words and identify respondents that they may want to exclude from the analysis. The third point here, and finally, and perhaps the origin story for this project, is that it might be possible to use self-coding as a cost-effective way to code large samples of open-ended data. This is certainly something that would make open-ended data with large N analysis very efficient, but we sort of cautiously suggest that that might be possible, and we hope that perhaps it could be. But it would require, of course, some major supervision. So finally, limitations. There are several. So self-coding is not appropriate for situations where the researcher might truly know best for purposes of their research what they're trying to code for. We can imagine some cases such as coding for tone of response, or perhaps very specific content mentioned by the respondents. We also think that trying to detect latent sentiment that may be subconscious to the respondent is going to be very hard for us to do with this. So there's a lot of rich nuanced data that we can't get at with this technique. But it is best for wanting to understand public opinion, specifically as the public understands it. And aggregation of data into larger categories always sort of introduces the potential for some bias and some miscoding. And this is a really, we think, convenient and rather easy way to help to check for that. So if you want to review more specific information about our study, we invite you to read it in Research in Politics. I think they're open source. Is that right, Amber? Yeah, huzzah. Yeah. And finally, thank you so much from the three of us. Amber is here with me. Rebecca is not, but all of us, if you're able to contact us, we're happy to answer your questions. And this is a beautiful snowy picture from our very favorite place to meet and write up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where it is quite snowy today. So thank you so much for your attention. We're really excited to hear your thoughts and questions.
Thank you, Amber and Jessica, for that presentation. At this point, Amber Boydstun and Jessica Feezell are available to take your questions. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. If you wish to be recognized and ask your question via audio, please indicate this in the Q&A text box. Otherwise, I will read your question during the Q&A period. And we already have a couple of questions that have come in, so I'm just going to start with those. Francisca Quas asks, do you think there is any social desirability bias involved in asking respondents about the broader categories of their responses? I think one of the strengths of open answers is that respondents feel they can talk freely, and I wonder whether some of this is lost if they're asked to categorize their own answers. Thank you for your talk.
I'll start off this one. It's a really good point. And so if you imagine trying to get at implicit racism, for example, you probably don't want to ask people an open-ended response and then ask them to categorize it into, would you interpret this response as racist or not racist, right? Probably wouldn't do very well. But you can imagine a different research design where you're wanting to see what kind of an effect, some kind of implicit bias training has on people. Maybe you ask them some open-ended questions at the beginning, and then you give them the treatment or not give them the treatment, and then ask them to identify whether their open-ended response was insensitive to a particular racial group. That would be really interesting to see whether they, are able to gain that self-awareness. And you're not going to do that by you coding it yourself, right? And it's probably that would be really neat to be able to see whether they're able to see their prejudice in their own language after getting a given treatment. That's just one idea.
I actually, whenever I teach social desirability, I often will just ask, could all the racists in the class please put up their hands so we can record them? And of course, nobody ever does. But then one time, one student did. And I said, what are you saying? Like, well, I think we all have racist tendencies. Like, oh, so what you're telling me is you're super woke, right?
Super woke.
You're not
the
a
best
KKK
humble
member
brag
here.
ever.
Yeah, I was like, oh God, okay. So even that was social evidence of social desirability.
Mm-hmm.
Another question from the same audience member. Did respondents get the opportunity to say that their answer was related to both categories? So for example, in the case of education, this could be easily the case. Allowing for this answer would also be a strength of your approach.
Yeah, so absolutely, that would be a strength going forward. But what we wanted to do was to replicate, was to compare this method against what we would get coding as researchers and coding as researchers using this very well-established code book. As with lots of code books, you're not allowed to pick both, right? You're only allowed to pick one code per specific statement. And that code then aggregates up into a broader category. So one of the lessons in iterating the code book would be maybe to say, we need to allow people to, to pick both of these items.
Yeah, that's a really great point.
I was going to, Jessica, do you want to add?
No, I was just going to cheer.
Well, I want to actually add to that, because a question I had during the process was, okay, so if the original code book says education as an explanation is coded as individual responsibility or is coded as group responsibility, to me that seems like a weakness or a substantive weakness of the design, because that is in and of itself an ambiguous attribution, right? And so I guess what I'm kind of getting at here is, to what extent are we essentially just detecting problems with a code book that shouldn't exist in a well thought out code book, and to what extent are we discovering things that we don't know?
That's a great question, Justin. I think that we are hopefully doing both if we do it correctly, right? When we're drafting a code book for the first time, we might think that we have a really concrete understanding of all of the different codes that responses might fall into. That is also, however, guided by our assumptions, our research questions, and the things that we're bringing to the table. So we think that with an open sort of feedback process coming from the respondents, that we might truly be able to expand our code book to capture things that they might have thought of that we have not. To the previous question, we put things into discrete categories, but that might not always be the proper, or at least more valid sort of representation of their views. And we would only know that by sort of asking people, saying, look, we would put this into this category. Would you also? Or are we missing something? So I think that we can do that, and we can also sort of interrogate some established code books and say, look, we're getting some funky answers on this one. It's possible that in the next iteration of this study that we might think to change this code, or refine this in some way to better capture the things that we think we're trying to measure.
I'll just add to that I think one of the neat applications of this method that we've talked about internally is what you could do with it in over time analysis, either panel or just repeated survey questions over time, that you can imagine that you could use it at one time point and just identify, there are some problems in our code book, like, education is just an amorphous category. We need to be more specific. But you can also imagine that this changes over time, that maybe, in this example of poverty, the attribution of drugs, right, as a responsibility of the individual, I'm guessing that probably, in 1980s, 1990s, pretty much everyone who said drugs might have meant that it's the individual's responsibility. It's possible now, after lots of different, shifts in media and social understanding of drug addiction, that when a lot of people say now drugs, they don't actually mean individuals, they mean government and society. So that'd be really interesting to see that shift.
I'm thinking there are cases where a categorization there is a right answer, but not everyone knows it, or not everyone believes it, right? So, for example, if you say, education is an explanation for poverty, there probably is a best answer in terms of what that means for attribution, but not everyone may agree with that. And that could be even more highlighted if, for example, you're talking about, like, what's I'm trying to think of some way to work in vaccines, right, for COVID, because there is a correct interpretation of what they are and what they do, but that interpretation is not shared by everyone. On the other hand, there are also contested explanations. So, is the Confederate flag racist? Well, there may be a correct answer to that as well, but it's certainly much more disputed than the case of, like, are vaccines an effective treatment for COVID, right? And so I'm wondering if you can tell the difference between sort of misattribution versus like contested attribution, and what the upshot is of that for interpreting open-ended responses.
It's a great question. I mean, in my mind, we would have to decide a priori whether we think something is or is not contested. But I think it's, but I think you could apply it to, to vaccines or to the Confederate flag, this kind of method of first allowing people to express themselves. I mean, as the question asker said, it's so important for them to feel free, these respondents, to say whatever they want to say, right? But then with that foremost in their mind, to say, okay, well, so when you think about that, is your sense that, the vaccines are good or that the Confederate flag is racist? I don't know if I'm fully capturing your question.
I mean, for example, if you let's say you were studying perceptions of the South and you ask an open-ended question, what do you associate with the South? And somebody says Confederate flag, right? That could be somebody basically saying Southerners are racist. That could be a Southerner saying something about the War of Northern Aggression, or maybe just the Dukes of Hazzard, right? Or it could be just a literal classification, like, hey, I've kind of seen that symbol in some Southern state flags or something.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that what this technique could do in that case is to show us that while we might bring certain predispositions to the code book and say, if you say the Confederate flag, it means a history of racism. Mm-hmm. By asking people to sort of give some feedback on that, we would quickly learn that there's a lot of different ways to interpret this, right? There's a lot of different interpretations that are not right or wrong necessarily, but that they think that they're sending. And when we're measuring public opinion, it's important for us to think about what they're trying to communicate to us, and that we don't lose the richness of that communication in shoving it into a code. And so by getting some feedback from them, we could build out our code book to perhaps say, the history of the South and racism of the South, or institutional racism, or honoring generational legacy. And, again, there's no sort of right or wrong here, but it would show us that perhaps a code book with one discrete answer or two discrete answers is insufficient to truly capture and measure public opinion.
So that response actually leads me to my last question, which is, there's a part of me that wants to say what's really wrong here is that we're trying to combine qualitative and quantitative methods in a way that don't really work, right? Because in an interview, if somebody says the Confederate flag, you can just ask them, right? What do you mean by that, right? If someone says education is an explanation for poverty, you can say, what do you mean by that? And they'll explain, presumably. Whereas in a survey, you have either a structured response where you've basically already determined the boxes, and you can ask them basically, do you attribute poverty to the individual, to the group, or to both? Or maybe you can give them one of those sliders or something, right? Or you just don't do it at all, right? In other words, you either interview them or you give them a structured survey, but the open-ended answer is kind of trying to combine both. And I'm wondering maybe if we need, basically, is this an argument for division of labor, or for conducting sort of sequential research where first we do interviews to figure out how to structure the survey and then we do the survey?
Well, in my mind, that's what this is, right? We're giving them an open-ended response that is kind of like an interview, right? I mean, it's the closest that we can get in Qualtrics. And then survey, we say, right? When you say that in your in the interview, when you said this, what do you mean? I mean, it's just so powerful doing the open-ended response as opposed to the discrete choice questions, because we don't want to prime them, right? I mean, when they think of poverty, they really might think of unemployment first, but when they see the list of options and we say, structural inequality, they're like, oh yeah, right. The woke kid in your class is totally going to then gravitate towards that answer because of that social desirability. So we don't want that, but we definitely don't want to be doing what we traditionally have had no choice but to do, which is to take those open-ended responses and to assume that they meant the thing that we as researchers would have meant if we had said that thing, right? And some of this is, I mean, Iyengar, I'm sure, would be the first to say that, yeah, that category of education, that, that might have been a clearer cut case 20, 30 years ago, but maybe it's not as clear cut now. Maybe we could anticipate that. But there are going to be a lot of other items where it seems so obvious to us as non-representative citizens what this kind of response means that just isn't accurate to what they mean. And it's, I mean, I think the thing that Jess and I really want to stress is this is such a low cost method, right? If you're going to go through the process of asking those open-ended responses anyway, just add this on to get some additional insight, and it's one question, right, or two questions, if however many questions you want to get, and it doesn't have to be categorizing them into substantive buckets like individual, government, society. You could ask them to code the emotional content or the tone of what they said, right? There are lots of different applications.
I would only add that I think that it's common, I've done it, to have really rich open-ended answers sitting there, and then you have so many respondents that you realize very quickly the only way to get through this data and to derive some sort of analysis from this is to put things into buckets. And that sort of movement from qualitative work to quantitative work without serious reflection on exactly how you're coding these things and whether you're actually representing the viewpoints that they're expressing, and perhaps losing a lot of data is sort of the concern that we're flagging here. And we think that we've identified a pretty easy way to say, like, look, we're going to stick this in a bucket. Is this the right bucket to stick it in, or would you stick it in a different bucket? And our sort of three-part response option for how they would code it is very minimal, but you could easily build that out to be a little bit more comprehensive to maintain some of the richness of the qualitative work that they're offering.
Including inviting them to name a different bucket, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask about, because when you have the buckets kind of, they're pretty well agreed upon, and the question just, where do you drop this one? I think there's a lot of power for that, because you can do, for example, exactly what you did, right? You can look at codebook respondent reliability, right? On the other hand, if they're making up their own buckets, I'd be really worried that I would get like tons of different, like, people putting things on really different dimensions, and if I saw that, I'd be like, oh no, I need to like restructure my survey. So is that like if you get a bunch of people saying, oh no, you've got the wrong dimension entirely, does that mean that this is better for a pilot study where you want to, I need to reorient this survey differently, or is there some way of like, just run it in the main sample, and then somehow you can fix it in post using this additional data you got?
I think it's both. If you take this example of ours, if you ran this early as a pilot sample, and you gave them, it's the individual's responsibility, it's government, societies, and you gave them the option of both, right? You said it's complicated, and you got, or you gave them an opportunity to name their own bucket.
Right.
And for people who said education, right, or for drugs, they predominantly said it's complicated, or here's a different bucket. Then that would do two things. It would first cue to you that you need to rethink your code book, but it would also say to you, there's maybe something really interesting substantively here that this is a natural way of categorizing things. It's the individual's responsibility as government or society. They're clearly perceiving some kind of interaction between the two that is interesting and maybe worth diving in, especially when you consider that, it's, a fifth of the people's responses who identified that item, right? You could imagine an entire line of research looking at people's attribution of responsibility as some kind of interplay between how the individual navigates the environment, right, with the structural opportunities or lack thereof that are provided.
As a this is more of a comment than a question. I think there could be some interesting overlap between this work with a lot of the sort of new frontiers in text analysis, and also in visual and audio analysis. Because more and more now we're trying to pour a big pile of text into a machine, and and then it does some stuff, and then variables fall out of the other end. And I feel like this is related to that work, although it wouldn't immediately there's no text analysis right in the paper, but you can immediately think, oh, wait a minute, like they're obviously doing something like that in order to produce those codes, right? So I wonder if getting that kind of respondent feedback could actually be real helpful for helping those machines to do their coding.
Yeah. We've found ourselves on some very interesting panels with this work, some uncomfortable panels in terms of the level of sort of algorithmically derived, text coding and machine learning. And, we're sitting over there with what we think is a, pretty basic technique. And it's been really well received as a way to sort of train, train machines to figure out exactly what we're thinking in a better way.
Yep.
Go ahead, Amber.
No, go ahead, Jess.
No, I got it. That's it.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say two things. The first is that so much of the premise of the text as data community and those initiatives is that the thing that you're trying to measure is not what the author intended, but rather what the reader takes away. And that's totally reasonable, right? And it makes a lot of sense that you that you take a sampling of tweets and you have human annotators annotate them, and then you train a classifier on that sample and you get it up to a good level, and then you can, code all the tweets, right? So that's totally appropriate, but it's a parallel and arguably just as interesting question, especially in our world of affective polarization, what the tweeter intended in the first place. And so this would be a way to have people, invite them to post a tweet and then say, when you tweeted this, did you mean to be racist, or did you, right? I mean, but a better version, obviously, right?
So, are you a bad person? Click yes or no.
Yeah. No, but when you tweeted this, were you feeling angry? Were you feeling excited? Were you feeling energized? Like, what were you feeling? Or did you, which audience were you intending this at? Or, what were your intentions? And that would be able to train a different kind of classifier, right? That probably would have a lot of overlap in the results, but not entirely, right? You can imagine that the same kind of tweet that makes most people angry as a receiver is not coming from a place of anger, but coming from a place of, righteousness or something else. But the other thing that I was going to say about the audio is that especially there would be useful, because it's so hard, right, to code what the actual emotion there is, because in cases of audio, often we really are interested in what the tone or the emotion, right, was of the person who's producing the audio, not hearing the audio.
Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat or the Q&A box, so I'd like to thank Amber and Jessica for being our speakers this week. I want to remind everyone that this presentation will be posted to our website shortly after the broadcast if you'd like to share it with a colleague or watch it again later. I also want to invite you to join us next week, February 11th, when we will host a talk from Naoki Igami of Columbia University. The talk is entitled Identification and Estimation of Causal Peer Effects Using Double Negative Controls for Unmeasured Network Confounding. And I have to take a breath before I start that title. Please see our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about this talk. Jessica and Amber, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you,
so much,
Justin. Thanks for organizing this. It's just a fantastic public service you're doing.
It is my pleasure. And I hope to see everyone next week.